Dmitry Alperovich. Thanks very much for joining me today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited for today's session. You're an icon in the cybersecurity space, and we are not going to even get into all the things you've done in your past, but for those who are maybe few and far between, they're not familiar with what you've done, maybe just to walk us through a brief memory lane.
Sure. I've been in cyber for over 2 decades and worked in a number of companies, worked on email security, web security, network security, malware security ultimately. And then I most recently co-founded CrowdStrike and was the CTO there until I retired from CrowdStrike in 2020 to focus efforts full-time on broader national security and geopolitical issues and writing the book that just came out, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century.
And we're going to be talking a bit about the book as well. But before we jump into that, so you immigrated with your family from Russia, I believe, to Canada, right? And then you relocated from Canada to the States. And you're also the poster child for the American dream, the success of somebody who's an entrepreneur. So walk me through some of that. You came in as an immigrant, you relocated from one country to another, very difficult. And then you follow some of the footsteps in your parents from education perspective. And then what propelled you to jump into the kind of becoming entrepreneur and creating that company?
I've always had that bug, and I actually started a small company doing encryption software with my dad when I was still in high school. So the interest in running my own shop and creating businesses was always something that I've had from the beginning. The story of founding of CrowdStrike is interesting because at that point in my career, I was not necessarily looking to do a startup. A company I was at was acquired by McAfee, and I was running a pretty big organization at McAfee focused on doing threat research and investigations there. And then in 2010, I get a call from my good friend Heather Atkins, who ran cybersecurity at Google, and she wanted to work with us on what became known, what I named Operation Aurora, which was the hack into Google and a number of other companies by China. And as I started working on that issue, I realized that this was happening all over the place, that this was not a unique event. And I ended up releasing reports like Night Dragon and Shady Rat that got a lot of media coverage about various APT activity, as it was known at the time, essentially nation-state intrusions from China across huge number of sectors across our economy and broader Western companies. And I realized that this was very common, and most companies had no idea that their intellectual property trade secrets were walking out the door. And my initial thought was, let's try to address it at McAfee, but it was too hard to innovate in a big company, public company that lived quarter by quarter. And that's what actually drove the creation of CrowdStrike.
And CrowdStrike is such an amazing success story. And if you take some of the companies out there, there are probably, I would say, about 45,000 products in the cybersecurity space. And I would say maybe 5,000 to 6,000 vendors. But CrowdStrike is, I would say, one of the top 10, if not the top 5. What do you think propelled the company specifically to become such an iconic success?
I think that it was a few things. And I have to give credit to luck and timing because we came on the scene right at the right time. And just as this whole APT nation-state threat began to explode, and we were there to capture it early on. And also at the same time as McAfee and Symantec were disintegrating into irrelevance. And our ambition from day one was to replace those big behemoths. And we ended up, of course, doing that. But if they hadn't stumbled, it would have been much, much harder. And then the other element of this was a completely different paradigm, different way of thinking about the problem, focusing on the adversary, applying intelligence about what was taking place. So much of the industry, actually the whole industry, prior to starting CrowdStrike was not really doing attribution, was not focused on the who. It was just looking at the technical threats that were taking place, a piece of malware, a vulnerability, an exploit. And we said, wait a second, there is a broader issue here, strategic issue that the boards of directors, the CEOs need to understand. And that helped to elevate the discussion and this issue over time.
Yeah, and it's very humble of you to say that it was also timing and circumstance and luck as well had something to do with it. But you don't see that quite often in founders. So let me ask you this. The creating CrowdStrike, you were involved in very high profile cyber incidents. And I would say that there's always this trade-off between individual privacy rights and implementing cybersecurity measures. That's also true today for government operations, for the internet as a whole, internet neutrality, and so on. What's your take on it? Are we moving away from having a free internet to having some sort of ability for government to monitor activity online?
I think that's always been the case. We just are starting to finally appreciate it. Again, as I worked on those intrusions from China back 15 years ago, it was very clear to me that nation states, first China, but then Russia, Iran, North Korea, they were in this field. They were breaking into networks. They were breaking into individual email accounts. They were stealing data. And now, of course, you also have the cell phone problem where it's not just about the data, but it's about tracking your location, perhaps recording the activity around you by activating the microphone, taking pictures, and the like. The threat to privacy is greater than ever, in part because these devices have become so ubiquitous and contain so much information about our lives on a day-to-day basis.
Since you brought up APT and that story, it's remarkable because I remember still in the early days of people just talking about it. APT wasn't even a thing until it was. It's almost something, I don't remember what it was, but it was maybe an incident or something that caused it to really propel forward and becoming a front and center, because up until that point, not a lot of people even knew what advanced persistent threat was. And then there was some sort of turning point. Can you describe what that was and what caused that kind of the collective mind shift for everybody to take notice?
I think it started with just greater exposure. And I can tell you that we lived it firsthand because we started CrowdStrike in 2011. And when we would have meetings with companies, we had to develop a litmus test to determine whether this meeting is going to go anywhere. And the litmus test was, have you had an APT problem? And if you get a blank stare, you know that it's time to wrap up the meeting because the potential prospect here has no idea what you're talking about. Or if the answer was no, do you have background, Mr. CISO or CIO, in the government, in the law enforcement or intelligence community space? Because, okay, maybe your company hasn't had the issue, or maybe you don't know that whether it's had the issue, but at least from your prior work, you're probably aware of the threat. And if the answer was yes on either count, then we were much more likely to get the deal done than if they were giving us blank stares on those questions. But over time, as we started releasing attribution reports and talking about it, and then, of course, Mandiant came out with their APT-1 report in 2013, I think, that made a lot of waves. And then a year later, the Justice Department did something groundbreaking, and I write about this in the book. In May of 2014, they released the indictments of PLA officers, and for the first time ever, U.S. government said China is doing this. And by the way, both the APT-1 report and the indictments were actually of the group that I covered in my Shady Rat report years early in 2011. So it came full circle. But all of those things have contributed to more public awareness of this issue. And of course, the hacking activity just took off as well. And we were dealing with more and more companies that got exposed to the threat simply because the FBI knocked on their door and told them that they had an issue. So all of that, I think, cumulatively changed the perception of industry towards this.
In your perspective, what was different in the methodologies, in the actual way, like the adversaries were hacking the U.S. government and the industries here from like before APT? What was so unique in the method that we're using and the outcome?
I mean, the difference between nation-state groups, APT groups, and criminal groups really, in most cases, is the very specific targeting and the persistence. In other words, they have a mission to break into a particular company or a particular organization because of what data they have. And with criminal groups, they're typically motivated by financial motives. So it doesn't matter if they can't break into company A, company B's money is just as good, right? So if you encounter security that's a little bit tougher, you just move on to an easier target. The old adage that the industry has used for a long time is you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the guy running next to you, right? The APT model kind of breaks that completely, because if the bear really wants you, it doesn't matter who else is running. And that sort of persistent approach from these threat actors of wanting to get into your company, to steal your intellectual property, to steal your trade secrets, is what made this so dangerous. Because, yeah, your security may be better than your competitors, but that doesn't really matter because they'll still be able to overcome it. And one of the things that we really pioneered in the industry, and a lot of organizations have now adopted this model, is the idea that you will not be able to prevent everything. That focus on exclusive prevention is misguided, because ultimately you'll have a mistake somewhere that an adversary will be able to exploit. There'll be vulnerability, perhaps a 0-day or a known vulnerability that has not been patched, or simply a human making a mistake and clicking on a link from a social engineering email that is sent to them, or something of that sort. And they're going to get in. But the approach, until really we came along, was always that if they get in, it's game over, right? You got hacked, it's done. And we said, no, that's not the case. And actually, others in the industry started taking that approach too. There was a famous kill chain Lockheed paper that came out that talked about the different stages of attack. And we said, look, just because they got in, that's stage one. They still need to move laterally. They need to elevate privileges. They need to get into other sources of data. They need to exfiltrate that data, right? They may need to maintain persistence oftentimes. And those all present opportunities to detect them. And if you take the approach of hunting for adversaries, basically assuming your network is compromised and looking for anything that's out of place, any signs that they might already be inside, you've got a much better chance of discovering them and evicting them than just simply passively waiting for some alert to file from your antivirus or firewall or whatever system you've got. Changing that mindset from prevention to detection and response really allowed for the creation of this new category of products, EDR, endpoint detection and response, and ultimately, I think, dramatically elevated the security landscape across the board.
I'd like to double click on something that you mentioned is super important. Specifically, you mentioned the intellectual property, and this caused it for no one to be safe. As our economies are becoming more digitized and it's a knowledge-based economy, even companies that were on the surface look like they're not a potential target. They were very much, and I'll give an example, might be a tire manufacturer based out of somewhere in the middle of the US that perfected the manufacturing process of tires for 35 years. And that secret sauce was very much a target. And then combine that with the inability to protect themselves due to the fact that they're maybe not in a high-tech company, created the perfect storm. Can you expand on that? Is that true, that there was nobody safe, in the sense that it wasn't just the target you would think there would be a target, like the large conglomerates, but also some of the mom-and-pop shops?
It could be. It all depended on what sensitive data you have that is of interest to, let's say, a state-owned Chinese company or another major company in China that may be leveraging their intelligence resources to break in and get into their competitors and get them that data. Not everyone had the problem. I remember I was meeting with a very large beverage manufacturer, and they told me point blank we couldn't care less about APTs because, we have no competitors in China. They drink our beverages just like everyone else, and this is not a problem for us. We care about criminals that are trying to steal our money, or ransomware. Ransomware came on the scene a little bit later, but certainly has become a huge problem today. It's not the case that everyone needs to care about nation-state attacks, but certainly if you are in the technology space and the advanced manufacturing, anything related to defense and national security, agriculture, all these industries where you have major Chinese competitors, you are at risk of getting hacked and having your data stolen.
And the nature of, specifically about the attacks, causes the ability to intercept those in a much higher difficulties, meaning that, for example, a nation state might take 6 months, 12 months to even several years sometimes to infiltrate an organization. And therefore, to be able to detect that is extremely difficult, right? And that's partially what CrowdStrike was solving, is the ability to over time detect the movement in the network, movement on the endpoints, and so on, right?
Yeah, the idea was that they'll find a way in somewhere. Somewhere there's a door that's going to be opened or is not locked, and they're going to walk through that door. But again, that's just step one. They have to go up the stairs. They have to open up the safe. They have to disable the alarm systems. They have to break the safe. They have to carry out the jewels and ultimately leave, right? And all of those steps represent an opportunity for you to detect them and evict them before they accomplish their goals. The focus was really not on the initial intrusion. The focus was on the breach, right? And how do you define a breach? The breach is your data is stolen or destroyed or whatever. And until they accomplish that, you haven't really lost anything, right? It's changing that mindset from you have to prevent it all, which is impossible, to some things are going to get through. You want to prevent as much as possible, but now you want to focus really on detection and response. Is really, I think, was a game changer in the industry in the last 15 years.
And Dimitri, before we move into some of the other questions I have for you, talk to me about you had some preview to some really cool incident or some things that were not in the public domain. Anything that you can share with us that are memorable to you, things that you've come across that, and I'm sure there's quite a few. I don't know, without divulging into the details, maybe obfuscate some of I would love to hear some stories from the trenches, actually looking at some activities online inside the perimeter and viewing the actual adversaries and making some movements.
I mean, yeah, there's so many. Particularly remember our work on of course, everyone remembers the DNC, but the hack of Sony Pictures by North Korea was really groundbreaking in the sense that you had an American company that was destroyed, whose network was destroyed by another nation state, all because they put out this movie. And it was the first time that attribution caused such a huge controversy, because I was actually the first one to come out publicly and attribute it, because we were working with Sony. They had actually sent me the malware that morning as their network was getting attacked. And I called them back within 30 minutes. I said, this is looking like a North Korean malware. Why did you send it to me? And they're like, we got to talk. And then they wanted us to come out publicly with our attribution. And the FBI later reaffirmed it independently as well. But I remember a lot of the folks in the industry were refusing to accept that. And there were all these conspiracy theories about an insider that was really damaging, not just to the company, but to the employees, because they felt like they were being now attacked and re-victimized. That one, their data is getting leaked out there, including their social security numbers, some of their medical data, and now people are accusing one of them of being the one to cause it. Really psychologically damaging. There's, I think, been very little thought that was put into it by people that were arguing this, of course, without any basis whatsoever, that this can't be a nation-state attack, and challenging not just me and our work, but the U.S. government's attribution that is based on high-quality intelligence, multi-source intelligence, and the like. And I think that trend actually began with Aurora. I remember when Google and then us came out and called out China in that investigation. Many cybersecurity professionals were saying, this can't be, nation states don't do this unless this is like Stuxnet level sophistication. This can't possibly be nation states. A number of companies were putting out reports saying this is a botnet. I remember Eugene Kaspersky actually was one of the people that was attacking me personally on all that stuff, saying that this is just run-of-the-mill crimeware. And that trend unfortunately continued through Sony and then later DNC and so forth.
And you mentioned a couple of things, attribution, right? So why is it important to know who's the adversary, who's the perpetrator? And then secondly, how would you know? Is the malware behaves a certain way? Is there any certain attributes or characteristics that for that particular malware that you can say, okay, this is for this group or this is for this particular nation?
Yeah, so good question. First and foremost, attribution is vital both at a macro level and at a micro level. So at a macro level, I've always been very passionate about educating our country and really the world about what was going on, because until you can recognize that you have a problem, you can't solve it. It's the first step in the 12-step program, but you got to admit you have a problem. So making it very public, because the government at the time was refusing to share what they knew from the classified realm, I felt was an important mission for me, because my attribution, my data was not relying on anything that was classified. And it helped, I think, to put pressure ultimately on the government to do more, because they were looking increasingly ridiculous, because here's Dmitry Alperovitch, here's Kevin Mandia, here's others saying all day long China is doing X, Y, and Z, North Korea is doing this, and Russia is doing Y, and the government has no comment. And of course, they knew all of this. They had information that was much better than ours in terms of very specific attribution that we often didn't have in terms of individuals and military units, intelligence agency affiliations, and the like, but they just refused to share it, I think in a very misguided way, because they thought it would be A, escalatory, which we now know, of course, is not the case, and B, that it would compromise sources and methods, and we now know that's not the case either, because they're doing this almost on a daily basis now with indictments and public naming and shaming campaigns. So that was really important, to start shifting the policy conversation of what to do about it by first making sure that everyone knew that there was a problem, and also helping educate the companies that this is a threat that you're facing, right? That this is real. And it's much easier to talk about China or North Korea or Russia or Iran breaking into your network than it is to talk about Agent BTZ or some other weird malware name that most of the executives will not care one bit about. But they understand countries, intelligence services, competitors. And then on a micro level, I always believed that it was important to understand who was coming after you, because then you can tailor your defenses, right? If you know that you're in the, let's say, automotive sector, and that you have a competitor in China that is likely working with intelligence agencies and is competing with you in the EV space, you want to protect your battery technology, you want to protect your self-driving capabilities against that theft so that they don't get an advantage, right? You want to protect your market data in markets where you compete. So it helps you to also get focused and prioritize what's happening. It also helps you to do damage assessment. I remember one ridiculous situation with the hack of OPM by China, right? And by the way, it was never publicly attributed by the U.S. government, even though everyone and their brother knows that it was China. Another ridiculous situation. But the Chinese government steals the records of millions of people, tens of millions of people that have security clearances, and steals their background check forms and the like. And what does the government do in response? It recommends that people get credit monitoring. I can tell you for a fact that the Chinese government was not interested in identity theft on those people, right? They were not interested in stealing their bank accounts or getting loans in their names. They were interested in getting that information for counterintelligence purposes, to identify potential spies, for recruitment purposes, try to identify people who they can exploit to try to get access to classified information. But unless you understand that, your response is going to be ridiculous. Let's offer credit monitoring, right? And of course, the government knew that, but because it was not tying the attribution to the response, you had these ridiculous situations that would pop up where you're offering protection against a threat that is really negligible, if not non-existent.
So on one side, you have the lack of attribution or misguided attribution, and then the other piece is that would say, what if the attribution is being manipulated to gain maybe some political clout in creating policies and so on towards other nations? Is that a risk as well?
You mean like false attribution?
Yes.
Yeah, people keep raising this false flag situation. I have yet to see in 15 years of doing attribution cyber attacks a single case where you had a credible false flag that was not detected right away. Real false flags are really hard to do, and no one's been able to pull it off in a very convincing way, particularly with full intrusions. There's been some decent kind of leak campaigns that have attempted to assume other personas, but in terms of actual hacking, to redirect attribution to something else, there have been a very clumsy attempts to do, but none of them have proven successful.
In shifting gears, you predicted the invasion of Ukraine by China, sorry, by Russia, and there was reports of cybersecurity attacks, cyber attacks onto the Ukrainian infrastructure. So it was almost like one of the first time there was cyber was attached to kinetic conflict. And in your opinion, as an expert in this field, what do you see that being? Is that the kind of the new frontier for battlefield, the combination of cyber and kinetic? What is the role of cyber attacks in the geopolitical conflict?
Yeah, I think there are lessons to learn from the Ukrainian conflict and cyber, but also important not to overestimate the importance of those lessons, because cyber actually has not played a large role in this conflict. Most of the cyber attacks that the Russians have launched have been pretty ineffective and counterproductive in terms of using resources. There seemed to have been a trophy hunting approach, particularly in the first couple of months of the war, where they were just trying to put scalps on the wall and breaking into anything that was vulnerable, from toy stores and other targets that have no consequence to the war effort, simply because they wanted to go back to their bosses and say, oh, look, we hacked 5 targets today, 15 targets today. It's the cyber equivalent of the body counts from the Vietnam War, where you keep saying how many enemy you've killed and not counting the ones you've created, and the fact that this is not actually contributing to your winning of the war. And so it's important for us to be cognizant that cyber is not the end-all be-all, but there are elements of cyber that are effective in this conflict, particularly in the intelligence collection space. And the Russians, particularly in the last 6 months or so, have really doubled down on espionage and trying to break into Ukrainian government and military networks, feeding that intelligence to their frontline units and using it operationally, sometimes within hours. So there, I think cyber is important, has been important, of course, and will continue to be important. But if you look at a potential conflict between other countries, let's say China and the United States, that the prospect of which I write about in my book, that could be a very different cyber conflict, because both militaries are much more dependent on network warfare. They're using much more advanced weapons platforms that are relying on internet-based connections. The F-35, for example, has a number of vulnerabilities in their logistics and maintenance applications that are running on unclassified networks. Those are not necessarily going to be decisive, but they could have a delaying effect where if you impact the readiness of a F-35 squadron, you can delay it potentially from taking off as fast as you need in a hot confrontation with China. So those are the types of things where cyber can play a role in delaying a military action. And then if you can use that to your advantage strategically, then it can be quite significant.
And what about preempting attacks, maybe with breaches into manipulation of critical infrastructure? There's a lot of SCADA systems out there that are responsible for our nation's infrastructure. And we've seen things like recently the shipping boat that just happened to divert from course, and we're going with this, and it collapsed a bridge, and there were a couple other incidents. Can you expand on our vulnerability as a nation of our infrastructure to rely heavily on outdated infrastructure, and then the ability for potentially the nation state to attack us?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, there is absolutely potential for disruption. Destruction in cyber is actually very rare and is fairly difficult to pull off, to actually physically destroy systems. It's not impossible. We've seen some attempts to do that, particularly, I think it was 2017 maybe, or 2019, I forget now, but a refinery in Saudi Arabia was attacked by a Russian state-affiliated actor, and they were trying to disable the safety system for that refinery that could have caused a fire and damage to the facility, potentially could have killed a few people as well. So those things are possible, but fairly rare and fairly hard to pull off, even though in that particular case did not work ultimately, because there are redundancies in many of these facilities where the stakes are so high, manual oversights and the like. It is possible that you might be able to bypass it, but it's not extremely likely. But what is more common is disruption, right? Where you can wipe out IT networks like you saw in the Colonial case, and even though OT is not impacted, people out of precaution can turn off that pipeline, as happened with Colonial Pipeline, or it can actually impact operations directly. You saw the GRU-affiliated cyber actors recently try to get into the OT sides of the water utilities in a couple of towns in America, and basically open up the valves, and because water overflows from those facilities, not extreme damage, but certainly causes disruption. And that's something that is a concern, again, from a delaying effect perspective. In most cases, you can deal with a cyber attack simply by turning it off right at the end of the day and disconnecting from the network and then trying to rebuild. But it can be very disruptive to your operations, to your business. So you could be out of commission for a few days, a few hours. And if the adversary can use that time to their advantage, then it can have a significant effect in the conflict in Ukraine. But probably the most significant cyber attack that the Russians had launched was in the first hours of the war, where they broke into an American company, Viasat, and used that access to send out a malicious update to modems, terminals that were in Ukraine that were connecting to their satellite communication networks and basically wiped them out. And that impacted the ability of the Ukrainians to communicate. Now, it wasn't the only communication channel that they had. They still had landlines, radios, other mechanisms as well, but it had an effect, right? The Russians ultimately weren't able to use that in a strategic way to actually accomplish their goal of breaking the resistance and taking key strategic sites like the Hostomel airport outside of Kiev, but that probably had more to do with their own incompetency than the potential that was there.
So what I'm hearing from you is that it's not necessarily the standalone cyber attacks that are going to have the largest impact, but the combination of the cyber attack and maybe some of the causes of the aftermath of what these create. Are we, as a country, are we doing enough? Is there enough? One thing that comes to mind: private and public collaboration, education, enough resources that are allotted to protecting our infrastructure. And what are the roles of private industry? CrowdStrike was a leader in dissecting and protecting from how many more of these companies do we require as a nation to assist us as a country to become better and more protected?
Yeah, and by the way, this is true of all warfare. It's never one capability. You don't win wars just with air power, just with artillery, just with tanks, just with electronic warfare. We have this concept of combined arms where it's all about how do you synchronize and bring all these capabilities to bear to achieve strategic effects. And cyber is just one of those capabilities and not even the most important part or far from it. So that's the important thing to start off with in terms of understanding conflicts. And sometimes there's too much hyperbole about cyber in the discussion about the impacts that it can have and effects it can cause. And it's often quite disconnected from reality, but it is a real problem. And, the government talks about this Volt Typhoon actor, which is affiliated with the Chinese government, that is infiltrating our networks, particularly critical infrastructure networks, both in the Indo-Pacific region as well as in the United States, and doing something different from what China has traditionally done. It is not looking for companies where it has valuable intellectual property or trade secrets. It is looking for places where you can have a disruption impact the ability of the United States to mobilize, to flow forces to the region. And that's of extreme concern to the U.S. government for obvious reasons, because, again, as I write in the book, we are on a potential path to conflict here with China that could come as soon as 4 years from now. And we need to make sure that we're ready on every front, including cyber.
And speaking of that particular topic, and we'll dive into it and dive into the reason why you went ahead and researched and wrote the book. There's some reports recently that China was involved in creating some of the civil unrest around some of the universities, the riots and things that happened throughout the United States, and also some reports about the involvement, whether true or not, involvement of some of the nation state into social media and creating some movements towards manipulating of voters' opinions on the political candidates. What's your take on it? I know it's a loaded.
I'm not too concerned about that stuff, to be honest with you, because it is happening. China, Russia, Iran, they're all manipulating our media landscape, trying to influence our elections and political opinions. But the reality is that everything that they're doing is a tiny percentage of the overall political manipulation that we have in this country that is mostly driven by domestic actors who are within their rights to spread misinformation because that's protected by the First Amendment. I think too many people get too animated by the fact that the Russians have some trolls on social media, whatever, putting out disinfo, when in reality, take a look, there's massive amounts of disinfo propagated by Americans on both sides of the aisle that probably is way more impactful than anything that the Russians could ever hope to achieve. I just don't get very animated about that stuff.
Yeah, makes total sense. It seems like what we have to worry about is actually comes from within. And with advancement of AI and real fake, is there a real threat from that, again, propagating, maybe creating some disruptions and so on? Because, again, we're having a hard time sometimes to figure out what's real, what's not.
Yeah, again, that is happening. That will continue to happen. But the reality is that you're only going to fall for it if you're going to trust these sources that are untrustworthy, right? And you're probably only going to fall for it if you want to fall for it, right? If you think, if you see something that doesn't strike you quite as right, that doesn't align with your political beliefs or your view of the world, you're probably going to dismiss it. But if this reinforces what you already believe, then you're going to fall for it no matter who it comes from, no matter if someone labels it as a deep fake or not, right? So it just helps to polarize us more, but I don't think it actually changes a lot of opinions of anyone, particularly when it comes to this election. I'm not sure that there is anyone who hasn't already made up their mind about the candidates that, of course, are very well known to the public now for many years, at least at the presidential level. A lot of that stuff is, I don't think, going to matter a whole lot.
Okay, let's dive to your book. First of all, it was quite the endeavor, I'm sure. You've done quite a bit of research, and your background makes you an excellent author with de facto knowledge and clout to write such a book. Talk to me about what was the inception, why did you decide to write it, maybe some of the underlying ideas that you had prior to, and then what did you want the readers to get out of it from
So I've been
reading?
concerned about China for 15 plus years now, particularly since Aurora, and highlighting what China was doing in undermining our economic progress. I coined the phrase that they are committing the greatest transfer of wealth in history, something that's been repeated by many government officials since then. And on every level of that competition, cyber obviously played a role as well, but also overcapacity, dumping, bribing companies and governments to go with them. They've been trying to basically destroy our economic prosperity and doing so in an unfair fashion. I've been concerned that this was, part of the overall national security case of weakening America in order to expand Chinese power and ultimately make them the global superpower. So that was the whole reason why I started Silverado Policy Accelerator, my think tank, is to work on this issue. But the book came about actually in 2022, the idea for the book, after the invasion of Ukraine. As you said, I was one of the first geopolitical analysts to have predicted that Putin was going to invade. I became convinced in December of 2021, about 3 months before the start of that conflict, that this was going to take place. And I wanted to raise the alarm bells about it. But of course, at that point, it was too late to do anything about it. I think at that point, Putin was committed to the conflict. And even though the Biden administration was trying to engage in some diplomatic efforts, as were the Europeans, to try to forestall it, it all came to naught. But after the war began and we witnessed the devastation, the lives lost, and the economic impact of that conflict, I realized that it was really important to raise alarm bells about the next conflict that I think is very likely to come, unfortunately, unless we do everything possible to deter it. And that conflict over Taiwan with China would be 1,000 times more destructive in lives, in economic value than anything that we're seeing in Ukraine. And luckily, with that threat, we still have time to make sure it doesn't take place. And that was the whole impetus for the book, is to raise alarm bells, but also offer solutions. Believe it or not, even though the book is called World on the Brink, it's actually a very optimistic book because it argues that we have all the ingredients to win this new Cold War with China, to deter conflict. The big question mark is, do we have the will and the patience to do so? And I start out with the book with a quote from Tolstoy, War and Peace, something that I had to read in Russian school, of course. And the quote is, the two most powerful weapons are patience and time. And if you read my book, what you're left with is the question mark of, do we have any patience left, and are we running out of time?
It's very impactful. And we've seen, hey, the problem is not just, I think we got to where we are today for various reasons. I think that during COVID and the kind of the supply chain disruptions, we realized like how heavily we are dependent on not just Chinese manufacturers, but other European manufacturers and so on. For that particular incident, it was the medical supplies and so on. But now we've seen that with chip manufacturers and so on. Like, how do we become more independent and remove our dependency from foreign components, foreign manufacturers? It's not something they can do within the next 2-3 years. It requires massive heavy lifting and infrastructure investment. We were very self-sufficient back in the 50s and 60s, and all of a sudden throughout those couple of decades, we really offset that. Where should we start as a nation?
As I write in the book, the most important thing is to understand that you have a problem. So just harking back to my early days of trying to raise the awareness about APTs and nation-state threats and cyber, I'm trying to raise the awareness that I think we're unquestionably in a new Cold War with China, one that is actually remarkably similar to the first Cold War with the Soviet Union. If you look at all the elements of that confrontation that took place in that 70-year period or so, whether it was the global competition for supremacy between America and the Soviet Union, you have that playing out with China. Whether it's an arms race, a conventional one and a nuclear one, you have that today with China. Whether it's economic warfare or a spy war or a space race, we're once again trying to get to the moon before China does, just like we did in the 60s with the Soviet Union. On every single level, we basically have the same scenarios playing out that have played out during the first Cold War. And the only argument that I often hear from people trying to say, oh, this can't be a Cold War, is look at all this economic interdependence we have with China that we didn't have with the Soviet Union. And one of the things I actually debunk in the book is this idea that the two economies, the Soviet bloc and the West, were completely disconnected. That is not the case at all. There were numerous connections. American banks were financing Warsaw Pact economies throughout the 70s and 80s. Much of the oil and gas industry of the Soviet Union that was, of course, financing this Cold War was running on Western technologies that were sold to them. We had sold military equipment and enabled some of the capabilities that they later developed early on in that Cold War. Now, the scale is different with China, unquestionably, and it's not exactly the same on that front, but the trend lines are identical. And I believe that we have to recognize that, first and foremost. You still have the Biden administration refusing to say that we're in a Cold War. In fact, you hear statements that are quite the opposite, saying that we don't want to be in a Cold War. When someone is punching you, you may say that you don't want to be in a fight, but you really don't have a choice at that point. I guess you could choose to lose and give up, but I don't think that they would want that choice to be taken. Unless you're giving up, you're in a fight. And you are absolutely in a Cold War now with China. And it's important to recognize that so that you can start working on solutions. Again, first step, 11 other steps, but really critical to take that first step. And then the second issue is, what are those solutions? And I believe the first one is making sure that Taiwan never falls to China. And the book talks about the importance of Taiwan that I think most Americans do not have an appreciation for. There's this very simplistic view of Taiwan as a semiconductor manufacturing powerhouse, and it certainly is that, and semiconductors are absolutely vital to the global economy. I don't want to underestimate the importance of that. But Taiwan has mattered to us long before the dawn of the age of computing. General Douglas MacArthur in 1950 called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier because of its strategic position in the region, because of how important it is for, if China is able to take it, they'll be able to, I believe, to dominate Asia, to set the rules of the security and economic order in that region, which is the most important region in the world, arguably, with almost 50% of the world's GDP, much of the supply chains, much of the economic growth. So deterring China from being able to take Taiwan is really fundamental to our national security, and that goes into military domain, but it also goes into economic leverage that we can increase over China and decrease their leverage over us in areas like energy, particularly green tech, in areas like semiconductors, in areas like critical minerals, where they have much of the processing and refining capability. But it is also about looking at how do you win the broader Cold War. If you manage to deter that invasion of Taiwan, and hopefully we will, you're still going to be in the Cold War. You're still going to be in this vital competition. And I believe that the way to win that is to win the technology race for the 21st century and identify 4 critical technologies that I think are going to be vital to the economic growth of the century. They are AI and autonomy, and pretty self-explanatory these days when you look at the evolution of those technologies, particularly in the last few years. The second one, just as important and related, is biotech and synthetic biology. Very exciting, the applications of AI to that field, not just in the areas of medical science that people tend to think about, but in the areas of bioenergetics, being able to develop new energy sources by combining biology and chemistry, and biomanufacturing, developing new materials using those type of processes. And again, AI is going to be essential to that. The third area is aerospace, space technology. We're seeing now, thanks to SpaceX and Amazon, what you can do with these huge constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit from a communications perspective, internet access, navigation, positioning, surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence collection, and the like, really revolutionizing the space industry in a huge way. And a large part of that was the lowering of the costs of lift into space that SpaceX and Elon pioneered with the reusable rockets. And then the last area is green energy. So that's everything from EVs, batteries, wind, solar, nuclear. And that's where China is dominating, of course. In the first 3 areas, we've got an advantage. In some areas, it's smaller than others, but in EVs, in green tech, we're losing badly. And then if you look at those 4 technologies, you also have 2 critical components that you need that go into those technologies. They are semiconductors, of course. And there we are on the knife's edge of either losing or winning, and we'll see what happens really in the next couple of years to determine that. And then the second one is critical minerals, which we are losing badly because China not only is trying to grab as many mining reserves around the world, but also, more importantly, refining and processing much of those minerals in China, polluting the planet, doing that with coal-burning energy, and dumping oftentimes those minerals below cost in our markets to make sure that no one else does it and that they keep our reliance on them. And this critical issue of rare earths and lithium and cobalt and nickel, all these sorts of really important minerals. Those are the 6 areas where we have to win, where we have to get leverage on China and reduce their leverage over us in order to win the Cold War. There's a lot of ideas in the book about how to go about doing that. I encourage everyone to take a look.
Absolutely, and I'll ask you before we part ways how to the best way to get hold of a copy. But just before we wrap up, I have 1 or 2 questions. We're seeing now the CCP. There's some issues in China, economically speaking. Is there a fear that in order for them to fix or divert some of the attention of what's going on internally within the economy, is there a fear that there's going to be an escalation to circumvent the public opinion by creating this common enemy?
Yeah, look, the CCP has a lot of problems on their hands right now, right? The economy is not going well at all in China. It is stagnating in terms of economic growth, fell rapidly from double-digit growth to probably around 2.5%, maybe 3% growth, which means that they'll very likely never eclipse the United States in terms of being the world's greatest economy, right? They're 25% smaller. If they're growing at about the same rate as us, that's the end of that. They've got a huge real estate bubble. The real estate sector in China right now is 30% of their GDP. At the height of 2008 crisis here in the United States, it was 10%, just to give you a sense of the impact. Now, it's a little bit different. They're not as leveraged there as we were, but nevertheless, the numbers are just absolutely staggering, right? Youth unemployment is over 20% in China. So you have all those issues that are impacting their economy, but at the same time, you have Xi Jinping that seems to be completely uninterested in economics, is pursuing this hardline, security-focused agenda that continues to aggressively pursue U.S. businesses and broader Western businesses out of China to replace them with domestic industries, to crack down on information that is available for due diligence purposes and the like. And I think that offers us an opportunity because Xi Jinping has been the best agent that we could have possibly had in China, right? Because everything he's done in his term in power has been done to the detriment of the Chinese economy and Chinese people. Obviously, that will all change if he actually moves forward with this invasion. But we have an opportunity here to leverage the gift that he's given us to, A, wake up the world to the threat of China, and B, make sure that a weaker China we can take advantage of by encouraging companies to move the operations out of China, move them to both America, but also other places around the world, Mexico, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so forth. This is the opportunity we have right now. We can't squander it, and we really have very little time, as I write in the book, to potentially address this.
Last question before we part ways, and it's been a phenomenal session, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. You talked about macro level ideas and issues. And I remember reading about the Cold War, the U.S. government was asking its citizens to chip in and take part. Is there something that we can do now as individuals and maybe potentially as cybersecurity practitioners to assist in, because yes, we recognize there's a problem, maybe assist in circumventing that and helping out in the kind of the general. Yeah,
actually, and this book is really written for the average American out there. It is not written for the 300 people that are part of the foreign policy blob here in D.C. I talk to many of these people on a daily basis anyway. I didn't need to write a book to get to them. But it was an attempt to get the broader American public to understand the threat, to start thinking about the solutions that are not just on the government to implement. Some of them, of course, are, but others are really upon all of us to take charge of our destiny, to make sure that we're waking up every single day and asking ourselves the question, are the actions that I'm taking in my business, in my company, contributing or hurting the national security of my country? And to the extent that you are not defending your network sufficiently against Chinese espionage that is enabling Chinese prosperity and the competitiveness of their companies, to the extent that you are encouraging the business to continue to operate in China, and particularly these strategic areas, whether it's AI or biotech or space or whatever, you're part of the problem. You're not part of the solution. You're making things worse for us, and you're risking war. And I do a lot of war games at Silverado, and we recently conducted a war game with the U.S. House Select Committee on the CCP on Wall Street with a number of very senior executives from Wall Street and a few other industries. And we're looking at this confrontation with China over Taiwan and what measures the U.S. could do on the economic front to try to deter it or respond to it. And the initial reaction from most of these Wall Street leaders was, we can't do anything. We're so ingrained with China that anything that we do on the sanctions space or export controls alike would be just devastating to our economy. And then when you start talking about the impact of a conflict, the number of American lives that get lost, some of these people actually pulled back and said, wait a second, I have a son in the Marine Corps. I have someone else in the military. I don't want them to die. And it's not just all about profits, and it's not just about making a buck in the short term. National security is important, and that's what everyone needs to be thinking about. It's not just how you make the quarter. You have to do it in a way that doesn't end up with economic devastation, thousands of Americans' lives lost on a daily basis in a conflict with China, risk of nuclear conflict, by the way, because we've never fought a nuclear power. God forbid we go to war with China. It may not stay. So this is an issue for everyone to think through. And the impact of that potential conflict will not escape anyone in this country, not a single person. So it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can on a daily basis, but also to demand more of our political leaders to address this.
Dmitry Alperovitch, thanks very much. What's the easiest way for listeners to get a hold of this book?
Yeah,
I'm assuming it's Amazon, everywhere.
Amazon. You can buy it in your favorite bookstores. Check out worldonthebrink.com for links to different bookstores around the country where you can get it.
Is there an
audio
where you read it?
It's not me reading it. We got a professional narrator because I didn't want to spend 40 hours in the studio recording this, and I'm not a voice actor, but there's a really good, energetic narrator that we got for the book.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's been very insightful, and it's very critical for the listeners to take some of the key ideas that we discussed today and then do something about it. Thank you very much, Dmitry, for joining me today. Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Take care. Thank you all for joining, and I'll see you in the next episode.